Hello, Eternal Life fans. Today, I'm going to be talking about selfishness in the context of eternal life. So, we all have a certain amount of time, money, energy that we have, right? And in theory, if your goal was to live forever, you might just say, well, it makes sense to spend all my money, my time, and my energy on my own eternal life, right? Buying supplements, just everything you can do for your own selfish strategy to live forever. In theory, that makes sense. But if you consider the possibility of a God, that changes things, okay? That adds a new variable. Okay, I always put the question mark because God is hypothetical. But if there was a God, then that should drive our selfishness level down into being more charitable, okay? Maybe, naturally people are very selfish, okay? Maybe they're really high depending on the person, okay? Or maybe just medium or whatever. But a lot of people, they get a very high selfishness level just naturally, okay? Because humans tend to be naturally selfish. But if you start to consider the possibility of a God that's judging you and everything, that might judge you, right? That is observing you and is gonna determine if you get to live forever, if you're worthy or not. If there's a morality test, right? That possibility, if you're trying to live forever, then the theory of spending all your money, time, and energy on yourself doesn't necessarily make sense anymore. Then all of a sudden, if you're considering a God, you should be driven more to being charitable. Okay, because being charitable, this might be one of the factors that people would be judged by. Just naturally, it makes sense. If you consider all the different criteria that humans might be judged by if there was a hypothetical God. One of the criteria could be our selfishness level, right? How charitable are we versus how selfish we are. This is one of the things people should it's a guess, really. We don't know, right? We don't know the degree that we'd be judged by this factor, selfishness versus charitability. But it would be unwise not to even consider that this could be one of the factors we would be judged by if there was a God. Not saying I know there's a God for sure at all. Okay, I happen to believe in God. I could be totally wrong, but I'm trying to prepare for the possibility of a God, and that drives me to be more charitable. Okay? Makes sense. So, you want to help people because that might increase your chances, okay, of this God helping you live forever. It's a totally different perspective. Now, some people would say, "Hey, Rowan, you shouldn't need this fear of this judgment of this hypothetical God in order to be charitable." Okay, there's other reasons to be charitable that have nothing to do with God. Yeah, there are. Okay, a lot of people want to be charitable just because it makes them feel good. Okay, if they were completely selfish with their time, money, and energy, they would feel awful about themselves. They would feel like a bad person because they're not helping anyone. So being charitable just helps you feel better about yourself, raises your self-esteem, I guess, it gives you more of a sense of that you're a good person or whatever, and that's valuable in and of itself. There's reasons to be charitable because people say, well, why can't you just be good and charitable just for the sake of being good? Okay, it's like a humanitarian, it's the humanism approach. It's like, hey, we can just agree on this, but it's all subjective, and still people are gonna. The fear of the hypothetical God is a powerful motivator, is what I'm saying. And if people only had this idea of, well, let's just be good, just for the sake of being good, because we're all humans here and we're sharing the planet and all this kind of humanism approach to the topic, people would still be driven to be extremely selfish with their money, time, and energy. And for some people, the being a God-fearing person, the fearing the hypothetical God, is going to completely be the biggest bridge, okay? The bridge from selfishness to being charitable. Because then there's true incentive, okay? Because if there's this God that, gets to reward people who are more charitable, and they're thinking, well, gosh, this God might actually determine if I get to live forever, then charitability makes a lot more sense. But yeah, in a godless world, like I said in the beginning, just being completely selfish with your time, money, and energy really does make a lot of sense. But as soon as you start to consider the possibility of God, how God might judge you, being so selfish doesn't make as much sense anymore. And you're having to weigh the pros and cons. Okay, yes, there's a potential that, the more selfishness, okay, the more you're spending on your own eternal life, the greater your chances. But then you're having to weigh that against this other possibility of being judged for being too selfish. Okay? And yeah, naturally, it would make sense that God, hypothetically speaking, this is all hypothetical when it comes to God, it does make sense for me, in my mind, that God would expect he would expect a certain level of selfishness, and we wouldn't be judged for it, because there's a good type of selfishness, okay? But there's a point where it gets too much, okay? Too much selfishness, where it's like you're this rich person, you're living in mansions, and you're, have this extremely expensive, all these things you're doing for your health. Even you can spend a lot of money on your health. If that's your only priority in life, you could spend thousands of millions of dollars on your health and whatever, and there's no end to it. But I'm saying is those people might ultimately fail, right? If this was a test of some sort, those are the people, in some cases, probably a lot of transhumanists are this way, I can imagine, that they're just spending like all their money on their own eternal life, their own pursuit of living forever. They think that's going to help them live forever, but in the end, if they're not accounting for the possibility of a hypothetical God, they really might not be helping themselves at all. Okay? So, just something to consider. And what's interesting about all of this is you might say, well, in essence, this all, even trying to consider being judged by a God and even helping people, could be a version of selfishness. Because if you're only helping people to increase your odds of living forever, because you're thinking, well, if I help people, then maybe the God would help me live forever, then even that could be a form of selfishness. You see what I'm saying? But it's like, I would think that's a good form of selfishness. It's like, obviously, if there was a God, we wouldn't be judged for like helping people. I mean, that would be a good thing. We would want to do that because the God would probably reward that kind of thing. But yeah, in a sense, it could be still seen as a selfish thing, but it's like a good type of selfishness. It's kind of like when Jesus said in the Bible, Jesus said, something like if you want to be first, then you have to be last. It's like the first shall be last and the last shall be first. It flips everything around. And yeah, it's good to consider that. Anyway, so this is just all something to consider for your own personal eternal life strategy, because we don't talk about this a lot. I haven't talked about this a lot. Alright, just to summarize here, naturally we'd want to be really selfish. It's kind of, especially if you're trying to live forever and everything, selfishness seems to, like, in theory, makes a lot of sense. But the fearing of God, being the God-fearing person, should drive you to be more charitable in your life. Way more charitable than you might naturally be inclined to be, right? Giving to the poor and everything, right? And you should be thinking, well, geez, there's starving people. There's all these, people suffering with all their problems. I really need to start helping them. I really need to stop being so selfish, because if I'm too selfish, I might be judged. Now, let's think about this. In the movie Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, Charlie was he was a very unselfish character. Very unselfish. He was very poor, and the little money he had, he would always, at one point in the movie, he bought a loaf of bread to feed his family. He gave his grandpa the little bit of money he had. He was just so charitable. And Charlie was the one that ended up winning the prize, the grand prize, the chocolate factory. So it could be a real metaphor for life itself. That things could be flipped around. The people who are most charitable, they might be the people ending up living forever. And of course, obviously, there's a point of being too charitable. If you don't have, if you're like at the point where you're sacrificing your life for people, maybe that's too much. I don't think God is, if there's a God, I don't think he's expecting us to be like this self-sacrificial person where it's like you're giving everything of yourself away. There's a level of selfishness, I think, what God would expect, and he wouldn't judge us for it. But it can get to be too much. Now, here's the thing. So just remember, just going to leave you with one point. There's the theory, in theory, being very selfish would help you live forever. You're spending your money, your time, and your energy on your own eternal life. But the reality might be different than you think, okay? And nobody knows really what the reality is in the context of this hypothetical God. Nobody knows if there's a God or not, so it kind of makes sense to prepare for the possibility of a God. You could be a God-fearing person, and it really doesn't, you don't have to believe in God to be God-fearing. You're doing all this stuff, even you're helping people, you're being charitable as a precautionary thing. You're doing it just in case there's a God that might judge you for these sort of factors. All right? Hope that makes sense. Thank you. May you live forever. Go ahead, leave a comment. Tell me what you think of this. Tell me what you think of all of this. Goodbye.